Hey guys, my name's Alyssa, and this is Murder She Crocheted, the podcast where we unravel dark truths, sometimes one thread at a time. Today's episode is a tough one, but it's a story that deserves to be heard. We're heading into the chilling and heartbreaking case of the Keddie Cabin Murders, a crime that shattered the peace of a quiet mountain town and left a family broken in the most violent way possible. It's a story about a mother who tried to start over, 4 lives stolen far too soon, and an investigation so botched it's hard not to wonder if the truth was ever meant to come out. This is a case about brutality, about people and systems that look the other way, and the relentless search for justice that's still ongoing, even after 4 decades. It's about loss, it's about silence, and it's about the ones who refuse to let this be forgotten. As always, if you need a breather, hit pause and take care of yourself, or I'll see you in the next episode. All right, so before we get started and dive into this week's case, let's talk about our crochet project. If you joined us last week, you know that we made granny squares that look like this. So we should have 13 squares, and if not, you guys got to catch up. No, I'm kidding. The pattern for the granny square and what we're going to make with them will be in the description box or the show notes. This is part 2, obviously, and the pattern is the sunflower granny square pattern from Cheryl Bennett. We finished making all our squares, like I said, and now that they're ready, we're going to join them together. And we're joining them together to make a tote bag. So grab your yarn that is the same color as your main bag and your 5mm crochet hook, and let's join these squares together. I'm using a single crochet through both of the back loops, but you can use slip stitches, you can crochet them through all 4 loops, you can even use a whip stitch, whatever your little heart desires. This pattern does have a template as well as written instructions on how to join, so just take your time and make sure your squares are facing the same way. And remember that there's no rush. We're here to enjoy the process and make some cool stuff. If you want to, which you should, share your progress on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, tag the podcast so that I can see all of the cool stuff that you guys make. I would love, 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 love to see it. So, with our yarn in hand, let's get on to the case. All right, so on the night of April 11th, 1981, a gruesome and savage crime was committed in Keddie, California, which was a very small rural town. I can never say that word. But it was small. It used to be a resort town. It used to thrive as a resort town, and it was located kind of by the Sierra Nevada mountains, about 87 miles northwest of Reno. It was known for a peaceful atmosphere and pretty tight-knit population. Keddie was hardly a place where you would expect a brutal and perplexing unsolved murder to happen. The crime, which came to be known as the Keddie Cabin Murders, claimed the lives of Glenna Sharp, her 15-year-old son John Sharp, his friend 17-year-old Dana Wingate, and eventually her daughter 12-year-old Tina Sharp. 4 decades later, and the case still remains officially unsolved, despite kind of compelling suspects and a lot of theories and renewed investigative efforts. And we'll get into the theories later. But we're going to dive into kind of every aspect of the case, from the family background to the heinous crime itself, and the investigation, both the failed one and the revived one that followed. Let's talk a little bit about the Sharp family. So Glenna Susan Sharp, or Sue, was born on March 29th, 1945 in Springfield, Massachusetts, and she had 5 children. She married a man named James Sharp, who was a Navy veteran and really kind of took on the role as homemaker. She enjoyed taking care of her husband and her children, and from everything I could find, she really thrived doing it. Now, everything was good until it wasn't. The marriage became troubled, and Sue reportedly endured a lot of domestic abuse and emotional hardship, and she finally decided that she was out in 1979. She left James because she was determined to protect and provide for her kids. When she left, she uprooted the family from Connecticut and moved all the way across the country to Northern California. She moved there because her brother, Don Davis, lived in Quincy. She figured starting over would be easier with family, which I don't disagree. But I think it was also kind of a safety net for her that she had her brother there in case her abusive husband showed up, which again, I don't blame her. So Quincy was a small town in Plumas County, and like I said, that's where she settled. Despite overwhelming odds, Sue really sought independence. She managed to make enough money to rent a small mobile home at the Claremont Trailer Village. And then in November of 1980, she ended up moving the family to the Keddie Cabin. Y'all, I've lost my scissors. If you've been crocheting for any amount of time, you know that losing your scissors is oftentimes catastrophic. So, anyway, like I said, she moved the family into Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort. The resort, which used to be a popular vacation destination, had fallen into a lot of economic decline after the collapse of the logging industry. The cabins now had been made into low-income housing, and they were far from luxurious. Sue still believed, though, that Keddie offered them a new beginning. Sue went on, while she was there, to enroll in the California Education Training Act program, or CETA. And it was an initiative that helped individuals re-enter the workforce because, if you remember, she was a homemaker. She took care of her kids and her husband. So she took typing at the Feather River College and then worked part-time at the Quincy Elks Lodge. The family lived very frugally. Their monthly income consisted of a CETA stipend and $250 from the military that was tied to her estranged husband. Remember, he was a Navy veteran. They also received food stamps. And even through all that, Sue was still known to be a soft-spoken and kind mother who honestly did everything she could to keep her family safe and together despite the financial strain and the trauma that they had in their past. Sue's oldest son, John Stephen Sharp, was born on November 16th, 1965. At 15 years old, John was known for his sociable nature and a strong loyalty to his family. He attended Quincy High School and had a particularly close friendship with Dana Hall Wingate. John had claimed the basement of Cabin 28 as his bedroom. It's funny to me. There's something funny about boys who just want to live in the basement, and I don't know why. Now, the basement that he lived in was only accessible from the outside. So the family often left the door to the outside in the basement unlocked so that John could come and go as he pleased. Friends and classmates described him as well-liked and charismatic. He was protective of his younger siblings and often helped Sue manage the family as the oldest boy. Next, there was Sheila. Sheila was born in 1967, and she was 14 years old at the time of the murders. She shared the upstairs bedroom with her mother and her sister Tina. She was described by neighbors and friends as mature but beyond her years, and she often took on the caregiving role, assisting her mom with household responsibilities and helping look after her younger siblings. On the night of the murder, she actually was not there. She was sleeping over at a friend's house, which we'll get into a little bit later. And that family she spent the night with lived in Cabin 27. The next child was Tina Louise Sharp, and she was born on July 22nd, 1968. She was 12 years old, and she was known to be quiet and shy, and those traits were likely influenced by a difficult childhood. While in Connecticut, she actually ended up having to be removed from her mother's custody by Child Protective Services on the suspicion of neglect, but she was eventually allowed to return to Sue, and the case was unfounded. Tina had developmental and cognitive challenges that required special education services. At school, she was frequently teased and ostracized because kids suck. And her vulnerabilities seemed to make her particularly dependent on her family, especially her mother, which is understandable. And the night of the murder, she had actually also been at Cabin 27, but she returned home at about 9:30 that night. Following Tina, you had Rick Sharp, who was 10, and Greg Sharp, who was 5. They were the youngest members of the Sharp family. Rick was active in local youth baseball and had attended tryouts earlier the day of the murder. Both boys shared a room in the cabin where they actually were sleeping the night of the murder. They had a friend spend the night as well, 12-year-old Justin Smart, who was the stepson of their neighbor Martin Smart. Despite the sheer brutality of what occurred in the house, those 3 boys were unharmed and slept through it. Now, John's friend Dana was also at the house. Dana Wingate was born February 8th of 1964, and he was John Sharp's best friend. He came from a troubled household in the nearby area of Gansner in Quincy. He reportedly struggled with drug use as well, including marijuana and LSD, and he had a few minor run-ins with the law. Now, despite this, he was described as likable and adventurous, and nobody really had a problem with him. On the day of the murder, April 11th, Dana had hitchhiked into Quincy where he was hanging out with John. The two attended a party that night. Afterwards, they returned to Cabin 28, most likely catching a ride from a woman. And that woman actually later on described feeling uneasy when she dropped the boys off at the cabin. All right, so that's the rundown of the family. Let's talk about the murder. On the evening of the murder, Sue was at the house with Rick and Greg and Justin. They had gone into Quincy earlier for baseball tryouts for Rick, and then they had come home, and on their way home, they had picked up John and Dana, and then later on, John and Dana then hitchhiked back to Quincy and went to the party that I talked about a second ago. So Tina and Sheila went to the Seabolt's house next door, and then Tina, like I said, came home at about 9:30 while Sheila ended up spending the night. So the next morning at about 7-ish a.m., her brother John lay on his back, his hands and feet bound with white medical tape and electrical cords. His face had been savagely beaten, and his body was partially sprawled across the floor with defensive wounds suggesting that he had fought back hard. His throat had been slit, and the cut was deep and very purposeful. It severed major blood vessels, and this blood spatter pattern surrounding him told the story of an extended struggle. Beside him, Dana Wingate's body was laying face down. Dana had also been bound with both of his ankles and knees secured, and he had suffered massive head trauma. His skull was showing signs of multiple heavy blows with something that was probably a hammer. Additionally, he had been manually strangled with bruising consistent with somebody using their bare hands. The way he was positioned suggests that he might have been trying to flee or maybe even shield John before succumbing to his injuries. Near them, partially covered by a yellow blanket, was Sue Sharp. She had been arranged, her body had been arranged in a disturbingly deliberate manner. She was nude from the waist down, and her panties were stuffed in her mouth and secured with medical tape. On top of that, a blue bandana had been used as a secondary gag. Her ankles were bound with an extension cord, and she had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. and her throat had also been slashed so deeply that it severed her larynx and nearly decapitated her. There was blunt force trauma to her head, and that blunt force trauma had left a very distinct imprint. It was an oval shape, consistent with the butt of a Daisy 880 Powerline BB gun. There was also evidence that the body had been positioned post-mortem. Jesus, y'all. So inside the cabin, there were also other signs of extreme violence. There was blood spatter everywhere. I mean, everywhere. It reached up the walls and across the ceiling. The couch, the chairs, and even the curtains had evidence of this frenzied attack. Knife marks were gouged into the wooden walls, likely from missed or repeated stabs. There were blood trails leading from the living room towards the bedroom, and a very large stain was found on Tina's bed, suggesting that she had either witnessed the crime, been attacked, or both before being removed from the cabin. Now, when all of these bodies were found, Tina's was not. So it's kind of a big deal, right? We have 3 murdered people and no Tina. So when Sheila saw this, she ran back to the Siebel's home. The Siebel took where she spent the night. James and Zanita and their children lived next door in cabin 27. She had chosen to sleep over that night to hang out with their daughter, Alyssa, who was just one of her really good friends, and they had a typical teenage sleepover, which in retrospect ended up saving her life. So after Sheila delivered the terrifying news, James Siebold ran back over with her to the cabin. He decided not to go in through the front door and went in through the back door to check on the boys because Rick, Greg, and Justin were still there. When he found the boys and saw that they were unhurt and still asleep in the bed, he opened the window and pulled out the boys one by one, getting them to safety. Now, on one hand, that's heroic, right? He went in and he saved the boys, and now we're waiting on law enforcement response. But on the other hand, this meant a civilian had entered a fresh and active crime scene before law enforcement, which could have majorly compromised the evidence, and it did. His entry and exit, though very well-intentioned, contributed to the ongoing circus of compromised integrity at the crime scene. The FBI initially got involved in Tina's disappearance due to the possibility of interstate kidnapping. However, once no concrete evidence suggested that she had been taken across state lines, the jurisdiction was handed back over to the California Department of Justice, because, of course, it was. And they, naturally, sent organized crime agents to investigate a rural quadruple homicide, not homicide detectives. Make that make sense? Y'all. So skipping forward just a little bit here, because I want to tie up some loose ends before we get into the investigation part. But 3 years after the murder, on April 11th, 1984, 3 years to the day, there was a bottle collector named Jack Pedrini who discovered human remains near Camp 18 in Butte County, about 100 miles from Keddie. He came across a portion of a human skull and a section of jawbone in a wooded area. A forensic analysis of the remains confirmed that they belonged to Tina. A follow-up search of the area turned up some additional items, like a blue nylon jacket, a pair of Levi Strauss jeans missing the back pocket, a child's blanket, and an empty surgical tape dispenser. These items were consistent with what Tina would have been wearing, or what could have been used to restrain her. If you remember, Sue had medical tape over her mouth. So the sheer distance from Keddie and the remoteness of the area suggested that whoever left her remains there knew the woods well and wanted her body to stay hidden, like murderers tend to prefer. So not long after the discovery, an anonymous phone call was made to Butte County Sheriff's Office referencing the find and linking it to the Keddie case. Shockingly, though, this call was never officially entered into evidence, logged, or investigated. It literally sat in a forgotten tape box until 2016, because when in doubt, we just shove potential confessions and evidence in the back of the drawer. So what emerged from the original investigation, if you can call it that, was a tangled mess of leads, missteps, and missed opportunities. Like I said, Rick, Greg, and Justin were found alive and asleep in the cabin, literally feet away from the scene of horror that would give seasoned cops nightmares. Rick and Greg, 10 and 5 at the time, didn't report hearing or seeing anything. Not a scream, not a scuffle, nothing. And sure, they were kids and it was late, but the sheer level of chaos in that house should have woken the dead, let alone 3 little boys. Some speculate that they may have been too terrified to speak up or that their memories were repressed. Others think that someone may have silenced them one way or the other. Now, I'm not giving you my opinions. I am stating fact or things that I have read. I will reserve my opinions and let you form your own. Now, their other friend, Justin Smart, became the center of attention. He gave multiple accounts over time, some wildly different than the others. Most notably, under hypnosis, Justin claimed to have seen parts of the attack, describing 2 men, one with long hair and a mustache and the other with short hair and glasses. These descriptions would go on to become the basis for police sketches. And this is where it gets a little ridiculous. Instead of bringing in a trained forensic sketch artist, somebody who specializes in sketch artistry, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office let Harlan Embry, a man with 0 artistic training and apparently the sketching skills of a 3rd grader, draw the composites. And it wasn't for lack of resources, because the FBI had provided access to all of their forensic sketch artists for them. Embry wasn't a cop, wasn't a profiler. He was just a guy with a pencil. The resulting sketches looked like characters and were unsurprisingly useless. These cartoons were circulated as actual leads, and it's honestly no wonder that nothing came from them. I mean, imagine handing your case to the guy who doodles in the margins of a crossword puzzle and then expecting results. This was par for the course in a case plagued by fumbled opportunities and jaw-dropping ineptitude. His account that led to the sketches ended up bearing a little bit of resemblance to Martin Smart, Justin's stepfather, and John Bo Boobity. Listen, y'all. And Bo was a friend of Martin's who had come to stay with the family. Martin, or Marty Smart, was a former cook at the Keddie Resort. He had a history of abusive behavior towards his wife, Marilyn. Neighbors and friends knew that Marty had a temper. Marilyn had confided in Sue also about the abuse that she was enduring at home, and Sue reportedly encouraged her to leave Marty. Remember, Sue had a background with domestic violence and her ex-husband, James. So that alone might have been enough to enrage Marty, but his jealousy and possessiveness was well known. He was controlling and quick to anger, and Sue's support of Marilyn represented a threat that he needed to control. Now, John, or Bo, I'm going to call him Bo because everybody called him Bo, Marty's friend, was a drifter and allegedly had ties to organized crimes in Chicago. He had served prison time for various offenses and had the kind of criminal record that should have raised some eyebrows. He was reportedly staying with Marty at Cabin 26 and had no real ties to the area. Some rumors suggest that Bo may have had an infatuation or at least fixation on Sue, and it was not outside the realm of possibility that his involvement was fueled not just by loyalty to Marty, but by jealousy or rejection. All right, so now that we have talked about the murder and we've talked about the horrendous police sketches, we've kind of touched on the suspects. Let's talk about the theories. Theory number 1 is the most obvious. it's Bo and Marty killed them. This is a theory, like I said, that's most widely accepted by those familiar with the case, including members of the investigation teams, both the old one and the renewed interest, which we'll get into in just a bit. Marty had a violent temper, like we talked about, and plenty of motive, right? If a affair, if he had been caught having an affair, it could have ended his marriage. And there are the rumors also that Sue had been trying to talk Marilyn into leaving because of the abuse. If you believe that, honestly, I don't know what I believe. But Sue was also allegedly a very fiercely protective and compassionate person. So if she thought that Marilyn was being harmed or abused, that could have brought up some intense emotional feelings. The marriage or failure of marriage alone is enough to trigger rage for Marty. Now, if we add in Bo, he was also a violent man. Again, no ties to the community, but alleged mob ties. And even people in town were unnerved by Bo's presence. There's also, again, the rumor that Bo may have been romantically interested in Sue, and that could have blown up badly in their face. Either way, now we've talked about Marty, right? But if we add in Bo, it gets worse. Bo, like I said, had no ties to the area, but did allegedly have ties to organized crime and mob families in Chicago. He was a drifter. He unnerved the locals. There's also rumor that Bo may have been romantically interested in Sue, which could bring up issues if she was having an affair with Marty or if she just simply wasn't interested. His demeanor was, in general, not fun to be around. And he also suddenly disappeared from Keddie right after the murders happened, which again is suspicious. And I do want to point out that Bo left immediately after the murders, and so did Marilyn. Just saying. According to this theory, the attack probably started as a confrontation, Marty confronting Sue, and then it escalated into a frenzied, vengeful bloodbath. This theory believes that John and Dana may have just arrived home at the wrong time and were killed because they had seen what was going on. The brutality of the scene and the overkill suggest highly emotional crime rather than like a cold-blooded hit. Now, also, another issue that doesn't look great for Marty is there is a handwritten love letter from Marty to his wife, and investigator Gamberg said if it's not a confession, it is pretty damn close. Quote, the letter was written on yellow flowery stationery, but was written just a couple weeks after the murder. At this point, Smart and Bobedy had been interviewed and allowed to leave Plumas County. They were in Klamath Falls, Oregon, and if I mispronounce that, I'm so sorry, please don't come for me. The letter states, in part, quote, I've paid the price for your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me that we are through. Great, what else do you want? End quote. And Smart signed the letter. Now, I know that initially that looks very bad, right? He paid the price with 4 people's lives, and there was speculation that he was in an affair with Sue. It's all very damning, right? And if that is the way that your brain lands on it, more power to you. Like I said, I'm not making your opinions, I'm giving you the facts. However, there are additional letters that were found that maybe aren't as widely talked about because it kind of negates that, right? So this one sentence was taken out of context. Along with the other letters, it falls into kind of like a family, if that makes sense. I'm rambling. I've got a point. The other letters talk about their children. Now they have 4 children. And the wording from the other letters kind of points to the quote that they're counting as a confession being about their children and not the 4 people that were murdered. Again, take that with a grain of salt or however you want. I will try to find a link that has all of the letters together and post it in the show notes for you to read. But Marilyn Smart also moved out of Cabin 26 April 12th, which is the same day that the murders were discovered. That is suspicious. Nobody really knows where she went after that and why, but it was no surprise, though. And she was angry that her husband was having an affair, allegedly, with Sue Sharp. She, too, apparently, was also seeing someone else. And that letter where they are alleging that it was a confession was given to the sheriff's office by Marilyn sometime in the past. Quote, sometime in the past. When she was asked about it in the new investigation, Amberg said that she claimed to not remember, but she did remember her former husband's handwriting, and she was shown the letter. In addition to all of that evidence, Sue Coletta, who studied this case and the interviews, kind of did a breakdown on her website, which I will link in the show notes. It's very good, of an interview that took place between Marty and law enforcement, and then Bo was there also. And one thing that I want to point out, and y'all, I'm looking at my notes and not ignoring you. In part of the interview, the law enforcement officer asks, was your wife still in the sack when you got back in bed? And then Marty says, yeah, when I got home, she was just gone, slept right through. Now, Smart says his wife was in bed when they returned from wherever they were, and he says she slept right through. What did she sleep through, right? It doesn't make sense. What would he have been sleeping, or she had been sleeping through? So then, later on in this interview, they bring up Justin, the stepson, who was in the cabin sleeping and ended up with the composite sketches. In talking about the possibility that Justin witnessed the murders, Smart said, quote, he is quiet enough to where he could have noticed something without me detecting him, end quote. So by saying without me detecting him, that implies that Smart was awake and suggests that he participated in those murders and he wouldn't have noticed that Justin detected him. If that makes sense. There's a lot of really good breakdown of those interviews on her website. Like I said, I'll link it in the show notes. Go read them. It brings up a lot of interesting questions. Like I said, there's a lot of good information in that breakdown on her website. I will link it in the show notes. You guys should go read it. It answers a lot of questions, but brings up a lot of other questions and good points. So theory 2 is that Tina was being groomed. This is disturbing, but unfortunately completely plausible. We talked about earlier, Tina had developmental and cognitive delays and was extremely vulnerable. She was known to have spent a lot of time at the Smart home, and it has been suggested that Bo or Marty or both may have been grooming her. Now, there was no signs of forced entry in the cabin, so if Tina had let them into the house that night, or was maybe told to, or told to leave something unlocked, it would explain how perpetrators got in without leaving a trace. She may have been coerced into helping. She may have been forced to help. She may have been manipulated into helping. Who knows? And perhaps she even just unknowingly lured her mother or John into the living room. Whether she witnessed the murders or was taken as part of a cover-up, the theory holds that she was later killed and disposed of when she became a liability. The remote location where her remains were found, along with her missing clothing and the presence of medical tape, supports that possibility. Theory 3 is that law enforcement covered it up. I know that sounds like a conspiracy thriller novel, but there are some pretty compelling elements to this theory. The sheriff, Doug Thomas, was reportedly close friends with Marty, and despite glaring red flags, Marty and Bo were not thoroughly investigated. Like I said, Marty allegedly confessed to a crime in his session with the VA, stating, "I killed the woman and her daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boy." He failed the polygraph, but there was no serious follow-up ever made. And if you remember the missing hammer that I said he reported, again, it was found in a nearby pond. The DOJ sent in organized crime agents instead of homicide detectives, and the crucial evidence, including the call identifying Tina's remains, were lost for a decade. And so this is either absolute sheer incompetence on the police's part, or somebody didn't want this case solved. Theory 4 is a third party or a cult involvement. Now, is that a stretch? Maybe, probably. But the excessive nature of the crime and the level of rage, this deliberate positioning of the bodies, the sexualized nature of Sue's staging, it leads one to wonder if this was a ritualistic killing. Now, there's no hard evidence pointing to cult activity, and there's whispers of a secret society or group that may have persisted in some corners of the true crime community. This theory is very largely speculative, but can't be fully ruled out because of the brutality and staging of the case. I don't know how I feel about that one, y'all. I really don't. So theory number 5 is a random act of violence. And honestly, this one really barely holds up. The crime was personal. I mean, it showed signs of being a personal vendetta. Sue was the clear focus of the crime. She was hurt badly, maybe tortured, mutilated, and then the posing of her body was humiliating. Tina was taken. John and Dana were brutally silenced. And if this was truly random, the level of control and manipulation and rage would be very oddly specific. And given the tension between the Sharps and their neighbors, the likelihood of that coincidence seems thin at best. Now, I know that I have made a few mentions about the new investigation or the renewed investigation and kept saying, oh, we'll talk about it later. Well, now is later. In 2013, Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood was in his third year of office, and he had lots of priorities to contend with inside the department, and his department was short of funding and he was short-staffed. However, the unsolved murder of the Sharp family still haunted him. These were boys that he went to school with. He knew them. He was familiar with their cabin. He spent nights with his friends and family in that cabin before the Sharps moved in. It was personal, right? So he decided to reopen the case. And when he reopened the case, he asked investigator Mike Gamberg to come back and lead the inquiry. Now, Mike had been a deputy during the original murder investigation, but was kept off of the case. Gamberg also knew the boys. He was their coach in martial arts and other activities, and even Dana Wingate was at his house the day before he died. So Gamberg decided to start from scratch. He had strong opinions about what had or hadn't happened 32 years prior, but he accepted the job and said, you know what, I'm just going to start all over. Now, what he encountered with the Keddie crime scene was a lot. He decided to roll his sleeves up and get into it, and box after box after box of evidence was sifted through. File drawers filled with information and other evidence were all in disarray. And then what made the case particularly hard to organize was that the original case history log, who did what and when and on what date, and all of that was gone. Just gone. He has his hunches about what happened to it, but it hasn't been recovered. And he doesn't really want to say what those hunches are. And I'm not ignoring it. I'm looking down at my notes. He said that a lot of the physical evidence taken from cabin 28 was still in storage, and that included like the carpet, the wallboard, and other items marked that have blood. The problem is that everything is disorganized. Some of the evidence is contaminated. Some of it was placed in a freezer to preserve it, and then the freezer got turned off. He says, quote, "This case is as screwed up as a soup sandwich." He said it's not about what was done, but what wasn't done. And that was a lot. He compared the evidence in 1981 to someone finding a shotgun loaded with evidence, and then nobody followed up with it as it spread. He was sorting, and he found a bag of evidence that was never opened. There were things that were never entered into evidence, breaking all kinds of chain of command, which is necessary for investigation and prosecution. Now, that bag of evidence that was never logged or sorted through or investigated was what he called a crucial piece of evidence. Sorry, y'all. But there was another, perhaps more vital piece of evidence that Gamberg discovered in an envelope. When he opened that envelope, there was the tape recording. When he opened that envelope, there was the tape recording of the anonymous caller to Butte County Dispatch about Tina's remains. When it comes to that tape, Gamberg is having professionals analyze the tape and recording and the male voice to see if he can match it to any potential or known suspects, like maybe Marty or Bo. And as with any evidence, though, it's a process, and scientific evaluation is slow, and crimes that old don't have the same priority, I guess, as newer ones. Now, Gamberg's opinion is that the tape was intentionally ignored. He says, quote, "I am not by nature a conspiracy theorist, but there are facts and circumstances, the number and the nature, which I can't ignore anymore." So he's thinking what we're all thinking. Although Marty and Bo are both dead, they were alive at the time of Tina Sharp's discovery. Bo died in 1988, and Smart died in 2006. So since 2013, Gamberg has followed all of the evidence that should have been investigated 37 years earlier. And Gamberg is not new to homicide cases. He has worked them before. And so there is faith that he is going to get results. Now, in 2016, Gamberg talked to the media and said that there was some new evidence that was discovered. And this was a hammer. This hammer was the one that matched Marty's and allegedly went missing before the murders. And then they also recovered a hunting knife in Keddie. Now, in 2018, Gamberg announced that there is more that links a living person or persons to this crime. Now, Gamberg nor Hagewood are willing to give specifics on who they're watching, but new evidence seems to have given them really solid leads. And I understand not wanting to give away your secrets, But at this point, I would like to know what they're sitting on, because I am. nosy and I like to know things. Gamberg has also stated that he believes that there were more people involved outside of Marty and Bo. He suggests maybe a wider conspiracy and hints at evidence implicating additional suspects, but has not said anything definitive. Now, before we wrap up today's case, I want to take a minute to talk about movies and media that have been inspired either directly or loosely by the Keddie Cabin Murders. And listen, I get it. True crime can be a slippery slope when it crosses into entertainment. But also understanding this case and how it seeped into pop culture can give us a different lesson on how society processes unsolved tragedies like this one. If you've ever seen The Strangers, and you're probably already thinking it, yeah, a lot of people, myself included, have made the connection between that movie and what happened in Cabin 28. The Strangers, directed by Brian Bertino, came out in 2008, and the story follows a couple who is terrorized in their remote vacation home by 3 masked intruders. Bertino said that the movie was inspired by the Manson murders and a personal experience from his childhood, but the parallels to the Keddie murder are hard to ignore. Isolated setting, check. Random brutal violence, check. Victims tied up and tortured, check. There's an eerie sense of this could happen to any of us, which is exactly what made the Keddie case so terrifying. Next, there is Cabin 28, which is a 2017 very low-budget horror film that claimed to be based on the Keddie Cabin murders. And, I'll be honest, it's a tough watch. Not because it's scary, because it's not. It feels very exploitative. Exploitative? That's a big word. That is an SAT. No, I'm kidding. The movie takes a very real and devastating crime and turns it into a sensationalized slasher movie without much thought at all for the victims or their families. There is little respect for the actual facts, and it leans hard into the horror tropes rather than providing any real insight into the case. If you're curious, it's out there, but I'm going to be real with you. I felt icky after watching it. On the documentary side of things, there's a 2013 film called The Keddie Murders by Josh Hancock. It is more of a fact-based look at the case using interviews, crime scene photos, and discussions of theories and suspects. It's not a glossy production. It didn't get widespread attention, but it is one of the few media pieces that treats the case with the gravity that it deserves. More recently, 48 Hours did a segment in 2018 called The Keddie Murders. They covered mostly the new investigation, including interviews with the Plumas County Sheriff Haywood and investigator Gamberg. The episode really kind of brought the case back into national spotlight and highlighted the discovery of the missing hammer and the potential DNA. If you are a documentary aficionado like me, it's worth the watch. People Magazine Investigates also did a featured segment on the Keddie case in 2017. Their episode was called Cabin 28. They focus on the impact the murders had on the surviving family members as well as the community. What I appreciated about this one is they balanced the retelling of the crime with fact, but sensitivity to the loved ones of the family. And then, of course, there are other horror films that kind of seem to borrow themes without directly citing the Keddie murders. Movies like Funny Games, both the original and the American remake, and Them, the French thriller, not the Amazon series, play with the same terrifying concept: random home invasion, violence, no clear motive. Whether intentional or not, these films evoke the same helplessness and horror that the Keddie Cabin murder represents. But here's Here's the thing. Whenever real-life tragedies inspire fiction, it raises some complicated ethical questions, right? How do you tell these stories without exploiting real pain? What the line between raising awareness and sensationalism? And are we as consumers holding creators accountable for how they handle true crime? For me, I always circle back to the people at the heart of the stories, the victims and their families. Sue, John, Dana, and Tina deserve to be remembered for who they were and not just characters in a horror movie. So whether you're watching Strangers with new eyes or thinking about how true crime shows approach these cases, I think it's important that we stay grounded in compassion. These were real people, and their story in this case is not over yet. They still are seeking justice. So for now, the Keddie Cabin Murders are still one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in California history. The victims, Sue, John, Dana, and Tina, deserve more than to be remembered as statistics in a cold case file. One of them was a mother trying to rebuild her life, a protective older brother, a loyal best friend, and a sweet, vulnerable little girl. They deserve safety, they deserve peace, and they deserve justice. Thank you for spending time with me today. If you've been crocheting along, I hope you found some space to reflect and maybe even find a little peace while you looped and stitched. This is what my finished bag looks like. I thought for a while that I was going to keep it for myself, but I met a wonderful, wonderful human here at my conference that I believe I'm going to give it to. Next week, we're going to dive into another case, and as always, I will have another crochet pattern. Please don't forget to follow us on all of the socials and our Pinterest as well for more free patterns. If you have a pattern suggestion or a case suggestion or a story you want to tell me, please send it to my email, murdershecrocheted@gmail.com. And don't forget to tag me in pictures of your projects. I want to know what you're working on. I want to know about the cool new yarn you found. I want to engage. So don't forget to tag me on social media in what you post or what you create. And until I see you next time, stay crafty and stay creepy.